When David Ramirez and his partner responded to a robbery report, he was surprised to find his son among the suspects. The teen refused to speak, so the officer sought the help of his squad to investigate the truth, uncovering a disturbing secret about his son. After completing their second patrol of the day, officers David Ramirez and James Peterson took a break for coffee and a bite to eat. The morning was unusually calm. David knew that such rare moments should be treasured, but as soon as the coffee arrived, a call came in on his radio. The dispatcher directed David and James to a nearby address because an alarm had been triggered. James quickly took a sip of coffee and made a frustrated face. "Here we go, the second false alarm of the week," David joked. Together, they headed to the scene in their patrol car. The radio informed them on the way that the situation was more serious than they had anticipated. An armed gang had invaded a store and taken customers and employees hostage. Although reinforcements were on their way, their car was the closest. This completely altered the officer's demeanor. The siren on the patrol car was activated, and David sped through traffic lights. 3 minutes later, the officers pulled over near the crime scene and approached the store with caution. After a brief exchange of glances, James asked if they should wait for backup, but David decided they couldn't. The risk of losing hostages or allowing the criminals to flee was too high. Seconds later, the officers burst through the store's door like lightning. "Everybody freeze! Put down your weapons!" David yelled at the robbers. But there were no armed men inside, just some terrified people who were lying on the floor. When David looked towards the back of the store, he noticed one of the criminals trying to escape down a hallway. The officer pursued him while his partner James watched over the hostages. The fugitive appeared to be young and thin, his face obscured by a hoodie. The young man tried to escape through a back window, but he was too slow. David grabbed the robber's arm and dragged him outside. The boy squirmed and kicked, but the officer handled the situation effortlessly. He searched the young man for weapons, but found nothing dangerous. David handcuffed the boy as James, his partner, approached with a smile, knowing they had saved the day. "One less punk on the streets, huh, buddy?" he said, coming closer to remove the perpetrator's hood. "Come on, kid, take it off." James removed the hood from the young man's head and looked into his eyes, but it was as if he saw a ghost. When David saw the boy's face, his expression changed from surprise to horror. Jake Ramirez was the perpetrator. "Son, what are you doing here?" David screamed in agony. Unmasked, Jake stammered apologies and tried to explain that he didn't want to do it, but had no choice. David was completely stunned and embarrassed, especially since James, his fellow officer, had witnessed everything. James approached and tried to console his friend, telling him to relax. "Take a seat, David. I called the station and canceled the reinforcements. This way, we'll have more time to figure out how to handle this, okay?" he said. "Take it easy. It's your son. Don't do anything you'll come to regret with the child." But David didn't want to hear any of it. His son had attempted to rob a store full of innocent employees. David asked Jake if his mother knew about it, but the boy begged his father to let him go and not tell her anything. He stated again that he had no choice, but his father firmly interrupted him. "We always have options other than crime, kid. You should understand this better than anyone else," David yelled, almost lunging at his handcuffed son. James stepped in to prevent David from losing his cool and making matters worse. They had to make a decision quickly. Throughout his career, David had always been relentless and never let a criminal escape, and letting Jake go now would be a serious flaw in his character and his role as a police officer. The officer remembered when Jake was 10 years old and they used to play together. At that time, the boy asked, "Daddy, if I do something wrong, will you arrest me as well?" The officer dismissed the question as a childish curiosity at the time. He never imagined his son could follow such a dirty and dishonest criminal path. So David laughed and assured his son that he would grow up to be a good person who would never set foot in a police station. Now, confronted with the facts, the father's blood boiled, confusing his thoughts. "Let's take him to the station," David yelled, nervously wiping away the tears that had welled up in his eyes. "You'll only be released if he explains why he's here as a damn thief." James couldn't believe it. Was he really going to arrest his own son? James tried to argue, but it was in vain because David was already dragging his son toward the patrol car. Jake was put in the back seat, and the two drove to the station as they always did with other robbers. As a father, David Ramirez was far from comfortable. It hurt to see his son thrown into a cell. What bothered the man the most was the question, why had Jake committed that crime? He receives an allowance and has all of his expenses covered. Even during times of greater economic crisis, David and Sophia, his wife, never let their son go without anything. What induced him to take part in a robbery? Are you serious? You're going to lock your son up here all night? James inquired before wrapping up his shift. David bowed his head, ashamed and confused, but knowing he couldn't let his son's wrongdoing go unpunished. "If I go easy on the kid, What moral ground will I have when I hold someone else's child in custody? Do you think that's fair? You'll spend the night here. It is my final decision," said the bitter father, bidding farewell to his partner and indicating that they would meet again the next day. After changing, the man drove back home in his car, shaken by what had happened. He still hadn't decided how he was going to tell his wife. How would she react if she learned that their son had committed a crime and that her husband was responsible for his arrest? At one point on the road, David came across an accident that blocked the path, forcing him to come to a halt. He allowed his mind to wander while sitting in his car, unable to move forward for a few minutes. The approaching ambulance's emergency lights reminded him of an episode from his teenage years. David and some friends would climb onto an overpass and throw pebbles at the cars passing below. It was supposed to be a harmless prank for bored teenagers in a small town, but one day, things spiraled out of control. David, who was only 13 years old at the time, showed off by throwing a larger stone than usual from above. The stone shattered the front windshield of a passing car, injuring the driver, who lost control and crashed. The accident caused a massive traffic jam on the highway, preventing cars and trucks from entering and exiting for several hours. Terrified, the boys fled to hide in a grove. They remained there until things calmed down. Although the car was damaged, the woman's injuries were minor and no one was held responsible for what happened. When David finally returned home hours later, a patrol car was parked outside, and his parents were speaking with a police officer who was investigating the incident with the parents of all the neighborhood children. Before the boy could say anything that would incriminate him, his mother quickly asked, "How was it at your cousin's? Did his fever go down?" For a few seconds, the teenager observed the officer, who smiled at him. Young David nodded and went up to his room. Minutes after the patrol car drove away, his bedroom door opened and his father appeared holding a belt. The officer had not suspected anything, but the boy's parents knew exactly what kind of son they had. They just never imagined he could hurt an innocent person. This was David's worst childhood memory, but it was also the one that changed his mindset completely and inspired him to one day become a police officer. The good old days, David thought to himself as traffic cleared. It was now his turn to teach his son a lesson, but unlike his father, without resorting to violence, he would use the law to show him that actions have consequences. With that in mind, he finally found a way to tell his wife about what happened. When David returned home, his wife immediately asked if Jake had called, as their son had left early and had not yet returned. The officer had no choice but to tell the truth, despite knowing it would devastate his wife. He carefully explained that he had arrested Jake for robbery and that he would not be returning home that night. Sophia had to sit on the couch and control her breathing so she didn't pass out. She was taken aback and didn't know what to say or how to deal with the news. She wanted to know what had happened because she couldn't believe her son had done something so despicable. What could have been his motivation for doing so? David affirmed that the boy had been caught red-handed, that he had followed police protocol. Sophia began to cry as she couldn't accept that her son was in custody. She argued with her husband, questioning why he hadn't talked to her first, as they could have come up with a better solution together. "I wasn't alone at the time of the arrest. And besides, you know me, this is the law, honey. For everyone, including Jake, our son," David said, his eyes welling up. He tried to be strong, but he was shaken by the situation. Had he failed as a father? Sophia screamed at her husband, demanding that he fix the situation. The man was tired and decided not to discuss the matter any further. He refused Sophia's prepared meal and went to take a shower. He couldn't relax at all when he tried to sleep. When he closed his eyes, he saw his wife and his partner as ghosts in front of him, implying that he could have resolved or dealt with the situation better. Dave had given up on trying to sleep. He stood up and went to Jake's room, trying to figure out why his son had acted that way. He looked around the room for answers but found nothing in the closet or under the bed. However, when he looked in one of the nightstand drawers, he found a notebook. A small piece of paper slid out and landed on the floor. David took it and read the message. "Nathan, $600. The officer turned the paper over, but there was nothing else written on it. What exactly was it? Who was Nathan? The next day, Officer David Ramirez paid a visit to Jake's best friend Marcus to ask about the mysterious name in his son's notebook. The officer noticed that the boy became very anxious after hearing Nathan's name, but he denied knowing anything. "You better tell me what my son has been up to," David said as he stared at the boy. "He's being held at the precinct. Do you want to be seen as an accomplice to the crime?" Marcus swallowed hard and spoke up. "Jake would never do anything like that, Mr. Ramirez. Nathan forced him," the boy said. David pressed Marcus once more. "Spill it, come on." So the young man admitted that he knew Nathan and explained what had happened. Jake and Marcus had gone out with some friends. They had taken one of the boy's mother's cars without her knowledge and were driving around town aimlessly for fun. None of them had much driving experience, but when it was Jake's turn, he wanted to show off and speed up the car. losing control on a curve and colliding with another parked vehicle. They were in an area full of old trailers, and the damaged car was old but had its side dented and windows broken. The bigger issue was that the car belonged to Nathan, a 22-year-old drug dealer who lived right there. When Nathan heard the crash, he went over to confront the boys. He immediately yanked Jake out of the car and demanded $600 for the damages. Jake said he didn't have the money and tried to explain, but he ended up getting punched by Nathan. The dealer, gritting his teeth, warned that he would get the money one way or another, even if it meant stealing, or Jake would pay the price with his life. The officer was sick to his stomach after hearing the story. His son had made a mistake, but he had been assaulted and threatened beforehand. When David left Marcus's house, he called his partner James and asked, "Hey, want to help me look for a guy?" He was last seen in the old trailer area. When the officers arrived on the scene, they saw a young man emerge from a car with a dented side and shattered window, carrying a backpack. James, who was already approaching him, called out from a distance asking if he was Nathan. Hearing his name and realizing two officers were closing in, the young delinquent bolted, leaping over a nearby fence. David and James pursued the criminal separately, surrounding the block. It didn't take long before they managed to corner him. Finding himself trapped, Nathan removed the backpack and hurled it at the officers, insisting that none of the contents belonged to him and that he was merely helping a friend. When David opened the backpack, he found drugs, a stack of cash, and a pistol. David immediately arrested Nathan and handcuffed him. He informed Nathan that he had gotten into a fight with the wrong teenager, his son Jake, who was in jail for being coerced into participating in the robbery by Nathan. Nathan sneered that Jake was simply paying the price for his actions. "That's just a natural law of life, buddy. Actions and consequences. Your son got what was coming to him," he said. David's anger flared, but James intervened to stop him from doing anything rash, escorting the delinquent to the patrol car alone. Jake had his court appearance a few days after Nathan's arrest. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, but at least this time, David Ramirez displayed video from the store security camera that captured the robbery, which clearly showed his son being cornered and frightened during the criminal's actions. The officer knew this wouldn't erase his son's involvement in the crime, but he hoped the judge would recognize that the young man had been coerced. The judge asked David to let the video playback continue just as David was about to stop it. Everyone could see the police officer's impartial conduct when he handcuffed his own son while wiping away tears. The judge allowed the defendant to speak before making his decision. The boy admitted to taking part in the robbery, but only because he was afraid for his life and the lives of his friends. He acknowledged his mistake and knew he could have told his father everything, but he didn't want to worry him or put him in danger from the drug dealers. After all, his father had to deal with criminals daily. After facing real danger, Jake realized the significance of his father's role in society and felt ashamed for not being honest with him from the beginning, disappointing both him and his mother. "I'm very proud of my father, and I hope he will one day be proud of me." David couldn't control his emotions and let a tear fall silently. At that moment, he realized that all the upbringing he gave his son had been worthwhile. The judge, impressed by the boy's words and Officer David's conduct, ruled that Jake was a victim and thus innocent. He would not be sentenced, but he would be required to perform 3 months of community service because he had participated in an infraction. And that was the entirety of the sentence. David and Jake hugged as they exited the courtroom like they hadn't in a long time. It was a hug that young David had longed for, and one that his father had never been able to give. But he would not make the same mistake of being too strict with his son. "I love you, kid," he said. "Now let's go home. Your mother has the dinner table sets." If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. And this other video that's appearing on the screen will most likely touch your heart as well. Enjoy the session and see you in the next video.